Welcome to The Community is the Medicine, an exploration of Indigenous community-based suicide prevention. My name is Darien Thira. I am a clinical psychologist who has spent the last 20 years working with Indigenous communities as they confront the impacts of colonization. Impacts such as alcohol and drug misuse, violence, trauma, and suicide. I have a PhD and everything that goes with that. But far more important, I have the teachings that have been offered to me by the elders who have been willing to spend time with me, and the children who have been willing to spend time with me, the youth, parents, and adults. And I was taught a long time ago that when someone offers you a gift, it's your responsibility to pass it on. And I hope you'll find that the gifts that I'm offering in the next period we have together, that come from so many people and so many teachings, are of use to you. We're going to begin by looking at colonization and its impacts as it relates to suicide and other community issues, and particularly how to make sure that we don't colonize communities by accident as we strive to help them. We'll then identify the cure for Indigenous suicide. There is one, although it doesn't come from any Western textbook. And finally, we'll explore that culturally rooted source of wellness and suicide resilience. Suicide prevention focuses on wellness. It's about promoting it. It is different from intervention. In true suicide prevention, the word suicide never appears. We're focusing on the development of wellness in individuals, families, and the community. If you're looking for skills for suicide intervention, that's a very different process and it's available from many sources. Wellness is what drives suicide out of the community, and it's traditional. Wellness is always rooted in the culture of a community. In Indigenous and Métis communities, suicide prevention requires moving beyond colonization. As we discuss this issue, I ask that you protect your heart because it can be very difficult. Traditional values have been the strength within communities forever. They have been through difficult times, all of our communities have, and yet we survive because of our values. Our values guide us and tell us who we are, how we're supposed to live our life, what is important. When I work in communities across the country, these are the values I regularly hear described. The way these values are expressed is culture, and they're different everywhere I go. These core values, however, they're everywhere. And these values, they do not naturally lead to the problems in the community, the violence, the alcohol and drug misuse, issues of suicide. That means those problems must come from somewhere else. And where they come from is colonization. They do not belong in the community, and a community that's healthy needs to drive them out. To understand how this works, it's worth exploring the impacts of colonization very briefly. Colonization can occur in our model here in 4 waves. The first 3 are familiar. The relocation of communities from their full territory into much smaller reserves, settlements, or villages. The criminalization of culture, so it's no longer permitted to practice Sundance or potlatch or any of the other traditional ceremonies. And the theft of self-government, creating dependency on the Indian agents and the federal government. And the theft of children and parenting and safety and all that went with it, residential school and day school systems. The 4th wave, however, is ongoing. There are more children in foster care than never went to residential school. This means the schools have not been shut down, they've simply been decentralized. This is not to say there are not excellent foster parents and social workers and counselors and nurses and all of those other folks who are human service workers in the community. There indeed are, but the system is still designed to maintain control by the government over the communities. It's done through rhetorical sleight of hand in 3 steps. First, we individualize our clients and say, you have a problem. Not you're responding naturally to the wounds in your community that come from the history of colonization and its ongoing violations. No, you have an individual problem. And then we pathologize it and say, you are actually sick. You are an addict. That's a sickness. You are depressed. That's a sickness. You have ADHD or a personality disorder or PTSD. And we turn a natural response to the wound into a sickness. And finally, we medicalize that sickness and say, there's probably something wrong with your brain. It is a neat trick. Let's just play a quick game here. Who has the disorder? The survivors of residential school who went through all of the wounds created by intentional cultural genocide, or those who created and maintained them for hundreds of years. Who is sick, but who gets labeled? Or consider ADHD. Attention deficit hyperactive disorder should really be called attention surplus hyperactive disorder, because people who struggle with this apparent disorder have too much attention, not too little. What they are, in fact, are gifted hunters. A gifted hunter has to always scan their environment to pick up the cues from multiple sources. But you put them into a classroom, and they're scanning the classroom, and we say they have ADHD. A cultural gift becomes a mental disorder because our classrooms are taught cheaply, where you get a group of children to sit still for hours at a time, listening to a teacher at the front of the room. The least effective way of teaching there is what we put our children through. So who is actually sick? Those children who are gifted hunters? Or the school system that says the cheapest way of educating children is the best? And again, this is not to discount the extraordinary teachers that even in this system prove their value. It's been pointed out that the colonizer has stolen traditional naming ceremonies that celebrate the gifts of a person and replace it with diagnosis that identify them with an illness. So now we have people saying, I am depressed, I am traumatized, that's who I am, rather than I am gifted and struggling with a wound that isn't mine in the first place. Think about an individual you may know who is struggling with personal problems, a Métis or Indigenous person. It doesn't take much time to be able to identify the problems in their family. The violence, neglect, alcohol and drug misuse, the chaos. But that family didn't come that naturally, just that the child is not born this way. Community problems create the family problems. Community problems like poverty created by the theft of land and economy, a sense of aimlessness created by the theft of parenthood and the theft of values and cultural traditions, and health problems created by the theft of ways of life. So when you think about it, the personal problems of most folks we know, they're not theirs at all. They come because of colonization. That means our job is not to fix a person or make them better, but to cleanse colonization from their life so they can reclaim the strengths that they've always had, their families always had, and that their community has always had. This is a real sign. It's time that we stop colonization and take the detour through traditional values into contemporary wellness. And this brings us to the cure for colonization. Many have considered colonization to be a disease or a wound. If so, there is a cure, and that cure is found in traditional values. I first noticed it when I was working in suicide-related work many years ago and was studying statistics. What I saw was that Aboriginal suicide rates, which are shown in the little stars here, we know are higher for youth and young adults compared to the non-native suicide rate, particularly on reserve. But what's talked about much less is the fact that senior citizens, that is, non-native older people, have a suicide rate even higher than Aboriginal youth on reserve. But elders, that is, Indigenous older people, have a suicide rate that 10 years ago was virtually zero. The difference between the youth suicide rates can easily be understood by colonization. But how can we account for the extraordinary difference between non-native seniors' high suicide rate and the low suicide rate of elders? Working with groups across the country, the answers are always the same. Elders are cared for by their families. Seniors go to old age homes if they can't afford to stay in their own home. Elders are respected. They have a voice that people listen to. Seniors have very little voice in mainstream culture. Consider a magazine like People magazine. How often do you see a senior on the cover, unless they've recently died? That basically says the only good senior is a dead senior. Elders have meaningful roles. When I speak to elders, they often tell me they're busier now than when they were younger. They are asked to sit on committees, to teach language in the daycare or the school, to guide their families as matriarchs or patriarchs. They're very busy people. Seniors retire. They lose their role. In fact, the idea of a snowbird, where a senior citizen will move to the States, somewhere nice and warm like Palm Springs or Florida. When I ask communities, if your elders were to go south for the winter, what would happen? And they laugh. Indigenous and Métis communities would never allow their elders to leave. They play too important a role. And finally, elders are seen to hold culture and spirit for the whole community, whereas senior citizens are seen as old-fashioned. When we discuss youth at risk, we'll often hear from them that they don't feel cared for in the community. They don't feel respected. No one hears what they have to say. They have no voice. And they have no meaningful role. You either go to school or you shut up and disappear. And school itself is not a meaningful role. You go to school so eventually you can have a meaningful role. And finally, many youth are disconnected from culture and spirit. This explains their higher suicide risk. There's another group who are growing rapidly, who are of great concern, and those are the elders at risk. These are the elders who are not playing a meaningful role. They tend to say, "Oh, we'll let the young people take care of that." Or they're still busy using alcohol or drugs or even selling it in their attempt to medicate their own pain. Or they haven't dealt with their own abuse, either as victims or perpetrators or both. These elders are not playing a meaningful role and they're not embodying culture and spirit. As a result, they're not being cared for and they're not receiving respect. Elders don't get respect because they have wrinkles. They get respect because of the role they play and the importance of their voice. In terms of psychology, these core values can be translated into the conversation of resilience. Resilience is the ability to overcome adverse, painful, wounding experiences. And in the literature and my own experience, I've found 4 roots to resilience. The first is connection or belonging. If you feel loved and you feel like you belong, it's much easier to overcome painful situations than if you feel isolated and alone. The second is empowerment. Empowerment is a feminist term that means power with rather than power over others. Those who feel empowered, they feel powerful with their community, are able to overcome pain because they can seek out resources, whether these resources are people or spirit or activities or places. When you feel powerful in the face of your pain, you can overcome it. The third root is a positive identity, and it comes from a meaningful role. I remember when I was 14 years old and skinny and spotty, I'd look in the mirror after coming out of the shower, and I would write on the steam, "Who am I?" I had no idea, but I was asking the wrong question in the wrong place. Who was I? I was a brother. I was a cousin. I was a son. I was a friend. I was an incredibly bad hockey player. But who I was roles I played, not just standing dripping wet in a bathroom. And finally, vision is seeing how we are meant to be in the universe and how we're meant to live. These four roots of resilience: connection, feeling loved; empowerment, feeling powerful in the face of difficult things; a positive identity; and finally, vision is our guide. Its values come to life. The way to bring all of this together is through the four directions or the medicine wheel. While I am quite aware that not every community embraces this model, it has been very popular in Indigenous communities and Métis communities, and I've often been asked to use it, so I'll be using it here. One of the points of the model that you see in front of you is that every value and its outcome in terms of resilience are a two-way path. Caring connection comes together. When you give somebody a hug because you care, you connect with them. But they return the hug, which means they care about you and connect with you. It goes in both directions. In terms of respect, when my daughter was ready to learn to walk, she really wanted to be carried, but I respected her enough to encourage her to take a few steps before I would pick her up and we would celebrate. This way, she gained empowerment. I could have packed her around, but she wouldn't have learned to walk. And I also gained empowerment because I was able to help her learn to walk. Spirituality and culture yields vision, and those who embrace a strong vision are endlessly curious to learn more about spirituality and culture. Once again, both directions. And finally, taking on a meaningful family and community role allows you to look in the mirror and see yourself as a contributor. And when you do that, it makes you want to look in the mirror more in order to become more of a contributor. There are always a few people in every community who seem to volunteer for everything, and that's why. Maybe the best way to bring this together is through a story. This is a three-part story that went from a good story to a great story to an act of genius. It's a story that was told to me, and I had nothing to do with it directly, except by being given permission to pass it on. There was a community that had a problem with at-risk youth. They would walk up and down the main street because they weren't going to school, and they would intimidate the people around them. The young men would walk with a real macho swagger, and the girls would do the sexy walk that they do at that age. And they would spit and make other people uncomfortable as they walked by. They also had a problem in this community with at-risk elders who were not participating the way elders are meant to in the community. So a person had a good idea, and with a colleague, it became a great idea, and it ended in an act of genius. The good idea was to invite the youth to go to the elders, these elders at risk, to learn a story. They went to the youth and asked if they could do that for the sake of the community. And the youth said, "What? Why us?" But finally they were persuaded, "Oh, all right." Then the organizer went to the elders, and the elders at risk gave exactly the same response. "What? Why us? Get the treasure elders to do it, the ones who are always contributing." But they were persuaded, and finally they said, "Oh, all right." It seems that when there are communities with elders that are struggling, you'll find youth who are struggling as well. So the youth went to the elders and learned a story. Now, this was good because the youth and the elders developed a caring connection. By learning the story and telling the story, the youth and the elders both experienced empowerment. And the stories were definitely cultural and about the vision of the community. But only the elders had a meaningful role in this story so far. Teaching is a meaningful role. Learning is not. We only learn so we can take on a meaningful role. The next step was a step further into wellness. The youth were then asked to teach the story to the children in the community daycare, while the elders watched and listened to make sure they did it right. Well, the youth immediately said, "Oh, we didn't learn the story that way." So they had to go back to the elders, properly learn the story. And then they went, and with the elders watching, they taught the story to the little children in the daycare. And the next time they came swaggering by the daycare, the little kids came running out and wrapped their arms around their legs and said, "Oh, come tell us the story again. We love you." Which makes it very hard to be macho. It's really hard to be sexy when a child says, "Up, up, up," and they have finger paint and snot in their hands and they're rubbing it all over your hair and your face. It made a shift as they walked up and down the main drag. Now, there were three groups who received caring connection: the elders, the youth, and the small children. And there were three groups that had empowerment. And the same three groups engaged in spirituality and culture with vision. What made this different as well is that the elders and the youth had the meaningful role as teachers. So often a community will seek to do a program, and it will always be about serving rather than calling upon the participants to provide service. For example, I was asked to write a letter for a community in the north to invite a comedian to come up to entertain the community. They felt this would be suicide prevention. Now, a comedian would create connection. People laugh together, that's connection. And this comedian was a very cultural comedian, so there would definitely be culture and vision in the humor. However, I pointed out to the organizers, there was no empowerment based in respect and no meaningful family or community role that would create a positive identity. Now, at first, they were frustrated. It's like, what are we going to do then? Until they came up with a brilliant idea. Their idea was to invite the comedian up on the Friday night, and they would do the performance. And on Saturday and Sunday, the comedian would teach the youth who were considered to be at risk, would teach them to become joke tellers and storytellers and comedians. So every youth would come with their own story or joke, and the comedian would teach them how to speak to a microphone, to stand up in front of people to tell their jokes, kind of to polish them to make them more effective. And then on the Sunday, the comedian was the MC, but the youth were the comedians. And they then got empowerment of speaking in front of the community, using the microphone, and the meaningful role of providing entertainment. This was true suicide prevention. Well, in the community story I was sharing earlier, the third step, the act of genius, was to recognize the contributors. So the next time there was a community feast, the youth were called in. They were the ones who'd normally be out on the porch smoking, but they kind of came in at the invitation and were asked to stand up, and everybody was invited to applaud them as cultural teachers. And then the elders at risk, who generally didn't sit at the elders' table, not even with their families, but they sat in the bleachers in the gym where the gathering took place, because when they're in residential school, they used to sit on the bleachers in the gym together there as well. But they were asked to stand up, and everybody gave them applause. Well, the next day, a group of elders came up to the organizers and said, "Why didn't we get to have that chance?" And another group of youth came up to the organizers and said the same thing. These elders and youth were considered to be at risk, but they were invited to do the same process. They were recognized in the next feast, and the entire community turned a corner. This is how wellness works. For every intervention, whether it's with an individual, family, or community, there needs to be an enhancement of caring connection, respectful empowerment. It needs to be done in a culturally and spiritually meaningful way to enhance vision. And it must include a meaningful family and community role that is enhanced through the process for the target group. So now we're going to take this model and break it into two parts. The bottom half is the well-lived life. Residential schools were designed to destroy the well-lived life by stealing a spiritually and culturally rooted vision from the students, from their families and the community, and removing the students from having a meaningful community and family role, instead making them students who could then serve as a cheap labor force disconnected from their communities. So we're going to start by looking at the role of enhancing the well-lived life in terms of suicide prevention, alcohol and drug misuse prevention, and violence prevention. The well-lived life is the antidote to colonization. When we speak about a culturally and spiritually rooted vision, people sometimes have difficulty getting a sense of what that means. I'll work with a client who will say, well, I grew up in foster care, I never knew my culture. Or my parents were too busy with their alcohol and drug misuse to be able to raise me culturally. It was more chaos and violence where I grew up. However, every single person I work with recognizes ultimately they do know their culture. I always ask this question: who is it that holds culture for the community? And the answer, of course, are elders. They're the ones who are responsible to show us how to live in a good way. So then I ask, think about an elder you've known who's a true elder. And if you've never met one, think about the elder you would like to meet and describe them. And these are the qualities that usually come forward. Elders are generous. They teach. They're patient. They're honest. They're loving. They contribute. And they're resilient, among others. And then I ask the folks I work with, have you been these things? And when they realize they have, that means you have been walking the path towards becoming an elder. You're already on the way. Just do more of it. I've worked with people who have lived for 15 years on the street, living in the rough, and still they have had all of these qualities at different times. They know exactly what it means to live culturally. There may be stories to be learned, there may be protocols to be learned, but the culture is within anyone who knows what an elder is. The second part of the well-lived life is taking on a meaningful role. A meaningful role is one where you contribute to others. Playing Nintendo in the basement, that's vacation from a meaningful role. It's vacation from family. You're part of a family when you're working together, playing together, laughing together. That's when you're contributing to the wellness of that family. And there are only 3 meaningful roles that I've come across in community. The first one is the protector. The protector might be traditionally the warrior who stands strong, the nurturer who looks after the small children and the elderly elders, and the healer. These roles, they're in the blood of every Indigenous and Métis child I've ever met. I've met 5-year-olds and they'll say, that's not fair, it should be this way. They're being warriors. Or they'll say, you can't hit my sister, only I can hit my sister. They don't quite have it right yet, but they're learning to be warriors. And of course, small children are amazing nurturers. They all want to hold babies or look after them. And finally, they're healers. They'll give us a kiss and say, oh, do you have a boo-boo? If you're sad. Or they'll look after
their teddy bear or doll like a doctor. It's in their blood. And when many people get into trouble, we think they're being bad, but often they're being cultural. Think of the youth who get into fights, but when you talk to them, they say, well, they dissed my girlfriend or my boyfriend, or, if they're going to be racist, they got it coming, or I'm loyal to my friends, I stand up for them. These are warriors. They just need to learn to do it more like an elder. They'll often look after their friends beautifully. Many youth, even the ones we consider at risk, know perfectly well how to take care of somebody who might be overdosing or who might pass out to make sure they get to somewhere warm to sleep. They already know how to be protectors. Providers traditionally have offered food and shelter, entertainment and ceremony to communities. Think of the children. They love sharing their food or taking a cup of tea to an elder. They love entertaining us with jokes, with stories, and they do their own ceremony. When youth sit together in a circle and pass around a joint, what they're often doing is ceremony. It's often a talking circle as well. Passing tobacco in a circle is a tradition that's been going on forever. They're just not doing it the way an elder would, and they need to be taught traditional ceremonies that accomplish the same thing. The same goes for the youth who get together and cut together. Cutting in ceremony is part of many different traditions, the Sundance being one that comes to mind immediately, and yet we often will get angry at the youth who are doing these things and say there's something wrong with them, rather than recognizing they're striving to do ceremony and they need us to show them how to do it the right way. Youth will provide stolen goods for each other. They'll provide drugs and alcohol. They're not being bad, they're being cultural. It's our job again to show them how to do it correctly. Finally, teaching is an essential, meaningful role. We've all seen 5-year-olds be instructors, teaching how to play a game right. They are role models for each other. They know that they're being watched by their younger brothers, sisters, cousins, etc. And the role of ambassador is essential. It's part of what makes a sports team respected. Sports teams from a community represent that community, and when they misbehave, they embarrass the entire community. Teaching, providing, and protecting, these key roles are essential. And when I am working with people who are struggling, as soon as I know they're not high risk, I support them to take on these meaningful roles. So when they look in the mirror, instead of seeing somebody who's got a problem, they see somebody who's making a difference to their family and community. Take a moment to think about your own meaningful roles. How are you a protector, provider, and teacher? We've now looked at the bottom half of the wellness wheel. It's time to move to the top. But before we do, I just want to mention a note about gangs, because gangs, unfortunately, do this very, very well. Gangs offer a sense of care and connection. When I work with people who are in gangs or have been, they say, well, you call it a gang, but we call it a family. Because gangs replace the family that's not properly supporting and connecting to its member. And gangs offer meaningful roles. You're a dealer, you're an enforcer, you're a thief, you're whatever the role happens to be. These roles are meaningful in the gang. And you have empowerment. You either get good at it, or you're in jail, dead, or kicked out as a wannabe. And finally, gangs definitely have culture. There are hierarchies, there are rules, there are uniforms. What gangs lack is a spiritual or moral foundation. They're only interested in making money for the people at the top. When you think about it, there's not much difference between a gang and many multinational corporations. Our job is to be better than a gang. We're now going to shift to look at how we can enhance self-esteem. And the reason we want to enhance self-esteem is it is what protects us from violence, alcohol and drug misuse, and suicide. Self-esteem is a sense that you are valuable. You feel that you are worthy. And when we feel good about ourselves, we are protected from the problems on the page here. It is different from arrogance. People who are arrogant, they say, I'm better than you are. It's always comparison. Self-esteem says, I am valuable, and so are you. The best definition of self-esteem I've ever heard is pride and humility. We need to have enough pride to know that our voice should be heard, that we are capable to do what we're doing. We need enough humility to know that we are not better than anyone else. When self-esteem goes down, it goes down in two directions. We feel despair, I'm garbage, or we become arrogant, because arrogance is low self-esteem, not high self-esteem. Arrogance says, I'm garbage, but I don't want to feel that way, so I'm going to make you worse garbage than me, so I can feel better. When people experience this, in despair, they identify and are identified as victims. If they go into arrogance, they identify or are identified as bullies. In fact, working with perpetrators of abuse and victims of abuse is virtually identical work. We have to raise self-esteem so they can take responsibility for protecting themselves and contributing in a positive way to the community. When people experience despair that's overwhelming, that's when suicide is considered. And arrogance at its most extreme, that's homicide. And this explains the terrible tragedy of the murder-suicide. It starts out by someone blaming other people for their suffering. You have made me miserable. And they kill them. And then they think, oh my God, I'm alone. I am unlovable. And they end their own life. It's low self-esteem at its most extreme. Both sides of the pendulum. So, to reduce the risk of suicide and homicide and other issues, it's essential we learn to build self-esteem. And to do that, we need to know what it's based on. Self-esteem is based on two sources of resilience. Connection, that feeling that I belong, that I'm loved. I remember when I was 5 years old, I was quite a misfit, and I was being beaten up by 4 or 5 other boys, and they kicked me and punched me, and I was on the ground, and I was crying, and tears and snot running down my face, and I looked at them and said, yeah, well, my mommy loves me. Which is, unfortunately, the worst thing I could possibly have said. For years after, how's your mommy? That's all I ever heard. Empowerment is that feeling of being powerful in your life. And at that moment when I was beaten up, I sure didn't feel powerful at all. I feel empowered. It means I can deal with what comes my way. These two foundations of resilience help us feel valuable. In the mainstream literature, they're often called social support and mastery. But those words are problematic for several reasons we can take a look at now. The sources of connection and empowerment are rich. Connection can come from humans, that is social support. Family, of course, is the most important, but friends, co-workers, workers who are supporting us, so many others. Coaches, they are definitely humans that are important as well. It can also come from a place. Think about where you go, and when you're there, you just feel like you're home. It could be in your home, or it could be a ceremonial or sacred place, or it could be a place on the land, or the water. But when you're there, you just feel connected. It can also come from nature. If you're living in a city, you look out your window and you see a tree, you just feel better because it's there. In downtown, you'll often find tobacco at the base of trees that grow up in the sidewalks. People are letting that tree know their gratitude. It can come from animals, whether it's a pet or an eagle you see flying, or a bear or a deer or any other wild creature. Of course, those who are engaged in spirit are never truly alone, and culture gives you a sense of belonging that goes back through all of your ancestors and forward into your future. Finally, people get connection from things, whether it's a gift they've received, or a photograph, a cell phone, a baseball cap. For small children, it's their stuffies or their blankets that give them a feeling of connection when they're alone. Empowerment comes from three sources. Empowerment can come from three sources. The first is a skill or ability. It might be in the face of a difficult situation, but it could also be good at math, or at hockey, or playing guitar, or singing. I mentioned these because I can't do much of any of those. It could be an attribute. It's maybe the fact that you are smart, or caring, or funny. An attribute is a quality that you carry with you no matter where you are. Or it might be a role. I feel empowered because I'm a good friend, a good parent, a good helper. That's the good news. Here's the bad news when it comes to self-esteem. Many of the sources are not healthy. People don't go to the bar because it's a cheap place to drink. It's much cheaper to buy your own alcohol. People go there because, as I said in the old show, everyone knows your name. You go there for social connection. The same is true for party houses. Abusive relationships are very difficult to disengage from because there is, of course, jealousy and violence and abandonment and betrayal, all of those things. And there's also, usually, love. And that's connection. In terms of empowerment, some people get empowerment by being thin to the point of having an eating disorder, or by being a bully and having people afraid of them. Selling drugs and not getting caught gives someone a sense of empowerment. You try to tell someone, hey, you shouldn't sell drugs to kids, and they'll say, oh, that's so true. You're right. I'll never do it again. I can't believe it. I'm now going to check their status card or their driver's license to make sure they're over 25 before I think about selling them drugs. That's not going to happen because they're getting empowerment from selling drugs. The same way you tell someone to leave in an abusive relationship, they'll usually say, you don't get it. They don't say, oh, I wish you told me this 5 years ago. I would have left then. Because they're getting connection. Finally, in terms of empowerment, most people use drugs and alcohol not because they really want to become an addict or an alcoholic. They use it because it gives them a sense of empowerment in the face of their pain, their anxiety, depression, their rage, most of which is trauma-based. When I work with people who are struggling with alcohol and drug misuse, I'll say to them, you tell me sobriety is hard. Sobriety is easy. If I'm working in a healing center, I'll put it this way. How long have you been here? And they'll say, well, I've been here for 2 weeks, so I usually see them in the third week. And I'll say, the food's okay, right? The rooms are okay. Staff? They say, oh yeah, the staff are preachy, but they're okay. And the other folks here? Oh yeah, we're cool. So basically this place is all right. Yeah, and every one of you is sober. You've been there for 2 weeks, you're detoxed. You're sober. Sobriety isn't hard. What's hard is Saturday night when all your friends are partying and you're not with them. What's hard is the pain that comes up that you normally medicate with alcohol or drugs. If you deal with that pain, if you find a positive social connection for Saturday night, you'll find sobriety is not difficult at all. And I would never tell somebody to stop using alcohol and drugs. That's crazy. It could be that's the one thing keeping them alive. The negative sources of connection or empowerment are essential to keep someone going. What we need to do is not take it away, ever. Instead, replace it with something better. We don't even take away the thought of suicide. We replace it with the pursuit of wellness. What does that look like? We support people to engage in caring connection, to respect themselves and others and find empowerment in the face of their life situation with support, to engage in culture and spirit however they understand it so they develop a vision that's life-based, and finally, to be meaningfully contributing to their family and community so when they look in the mirror, they don't see someone with a problem, they see someone who's making a difference. The way to prevent suicide is to pursue the path of wellness. Our job is to help every one of the individuals and families we know to become elders. That is the opposite of suicide. When responding to an Indigenous or Métis person in distress, it's important to remember that it is not going to be the government that's going to be the source of their healing, but the community. And when we're assisting them, we are always a bridge, but never the destination when it comes to healing. We are a bridge to help a person be strong enough and offer them the support they need to go back into the community where the healing takes place. The community has always been and will always be the medicine. To accomplish this, we have to decolonize our practice so we don't run the risk of colonizing a person in order, in our own mind, to help them. And this can be accomplished in 3 steps. The first step is to not focus on the problems with which a person is struggling, but instead identify and work with the opportunities for enhanced resilience. I know that I have looked at clinical reports of somebody I was going to meet in order to work with, and when I read the reports, I was terrified. The person sounded like a deeply wounded person who could be dangerous, could be overwhelming to work with. But when I finally met them, I met a remarkable person who was incredibly resilient, had overcome so much, had so many skills and strengths, and they were not noted at all in the report because it focused on the problem. As long as we focus on the problems of those we work with, we're doing the colonial job of pathologizing a person rather than assisting them in their wellness. So, we need to shift from problems to opportunities. Here's an example of a 24-year-old person that I might work with. It's a blend of different people I've worked with before. They only have a grade 9 education, unemployed. They are couch surfing because they have been kicked out of their home due to their alcohol and pill misuse. They have smashed up their home, they have stolen stuff from their family home, so they were kicked out. They have 2 children and they have no contact with them. And what brought them to me was a domestic violence court date coming up. They also have 2 previous assault convictions, and when you think about that, you know that the 3rd conviction for domestic violence could be a 3rd strike you're out situation, and they're looking at jail time, something they want to avoid. They have a sexual and physical abuse history, impacts of fetal alcohol perhaps not properly diagnosed. They have hepatitis C, and they're not connected to their parents due to their acting out, and the chaos that's in their home when they grew up. Well, this might sound like an interesting report if you were to read it, and you might think, I must take care of these issues with this person. I am utterly uninterested in what was just said. This is where the interest lies clinically. They have a grade 9 education. Therefore, I'll speak to them about completing secondary school, if that's what they want. They're unemployed, then I'll support them as they go through the steps required to seek and attain employment. They're couch surfing. We'll work on the goal of finding a stable home. In terms of alcohol and pill misuse, sobriety, non-problematic use, no contact with children, they need to engage with their children. Domestic violence court date, the goal is to restore harmony. They might go to jail, But we all know that when someone comes back from jail after even 2-3 years, the community doesn't say, oh, we're so glad they're back. The community says, oh, damn, 2 years already? Because harmony has never been restored. The colonial legal system has nothing to do with community harmony. That is a goal worth pursuing. 2 assault convictions, same thing. Healing, finding the right support for any deficits they might have due to fetal alcohol effects. Cure hepatitis C with some of the new cures that are available. And find a supportive mentor for them until they're able to re-engage with their parents. These are worth talking about. I mean, there's nothing more depressing than talking to someone about their depression. Instead, spend the time with them exploring opportunities for resilience. The second step is a shift from focusing on the individual to the community as a source of their identity and engagement, a source of their wellness and resilience. When you think about an Indigenous or Métis person, they don't exist in themselves. They always are part of a family. This is family of origin, family by relationship, and family of choice. When we ask somebody who they are, we talk about the families in which we live. And the individuals in their life are also important, whether it's their best friend, or a coach, or a counselor, or the child of someone they know. Anyone they know by name is part of their life. If they recognize their face, same thing. It could be the person who works at the grocery store. These individuals are important to them. They're part of the community in which they live. And as we'll discover shortly, they're also part of each person. Now, think of the individuals in the community. They're surrounded by community groups, agencies, programs, and services. These are the groups, agencies, services where the members may change, but it will continually be the same thing. The school may have different teachers, but it stays the school. Band council or mayor and council, different members, but it's still that particular bureaucracy. Health center may have different people, but it's still the health center. The friendship center may have different people, but it's still the friendship center, etc. This is true for AA as well, or any support group, or a cultural drumming or dancing group, or a singing group. It's also true for a sports team. The members may change, but it stays the same sports team. People are part of groups like this as well. And surrounding such groups in the community is the outside community, whether it's the nearest Indigenous or Métis community, or it's a larger town or city, or a place where there's a hospital or a healing center, a university. It's also the books, internet, television, everything that comes into the community from the outside. That's all part of the outside community experience of a member of that community. And finally, surrounding all of that and holding it like a bowl is nature and spirit, which contains everything. This is not just where you live. It's also inside you. It's who you are. Consider if someone you knew passed away. Where would you feel the pain? In the community where they live, or in your heart? Clearly it's in your heart. That means everyone, every group, all of nature and spirit that you experience is inside you as well as outside you. This interconnection is a traditional cultural way of seeing the world that has been here forever. And it's essential that we bring this into the healing work we do. The whole community becomes a resilience resource because the whole community is inside us. If a dear friend of yours has success, you feel empowered. If someone you love has this rich relationship experience and they're so happy, you feel happy and better connected. Our self-esteem is based on others as well as ourselves. Of course, our role and our cultural vision is equally about the whole community and not just ourselves. The third step is to take these first two shifting from problems to opportunities, thinking about the individuals interconnected to the entire community, and then shifting away from government-sanctioned to community cultural resources. So what is a resilience resource, and how is it different from a government-sanctioned problem resource? Well, a government-sanctioned resource for, let's say, alcohol and drug misuse, there are very few of them. There is treatment programs, healing centers, perhaps counselors, detox programs, maybe the hospital, and that's kind of all there is. There's always a complaint there's not enough resources. In fact, there are far more resources than that when we rethink them in terms of resilience. A resilience resource is any source of self-esteem, any activity or person or program that will engage connection or a sense of empowerment, or any source of a well-lived life, contribution activities that promote a positive identity, or cultural and spiritual activities that engage a strong vision. These are resilience resources, and they may include a professional such as a counselor, of course, but also an elder or a family member. Honestly, if I were suicidal like I was when I was very young, I would go to my daughter. When I'm with her, there's no way I would be suicidal. She's the strongest resource I have if suicide were to enter my life again. Time on the land and ceremony or prayer, this is a resource we can't ignore. In fact, many isolated communities have far more resources related to the land than urban folk. Though so often we hear a small community say, there's no resources here compared to the city. I'm going to argue the opposite is true. Positive activities, an opportunity to contribute particularly, these are the resources that are true healing resources. And when we look at them in terms of a map, we have a richness open up in front of us. Here's the community, self, family, individuals, the community groups, agencies, services, programs, etc., outside community, and nature and spirit. And all we've done here is divided it by the four sources of resilience: caring connection, respectful empowerment, meaningful role identity, and cultural and spiritual vision. And what that gives you is this rich map where we can target resilience opportunities. Thinking back to the young man we met very briefly a moment ago, we're going to use that map to help him. But first, we're going to use a guide to do it. Here are the four sources of resilience. To use them properly with a person who's in distress, we need to remember to use at least one community and cultural resource for every resource that is government sanctioned and paid. Put another way, we want at least one opportunity resource for every problem resource, including opportunities to contribute as much as direct healing. Going back to that example, of course the young man was going to need a lawyer. He's got an upcoming court date. But he might spend time with his grandfather, learning what it is to be a man, because he clearly is struggling with that. Now his grandfather himself might be a fairly heavy drinker. But when his grandson comes who's struggling with alcohol, he's going to put away the alcohol, put it into the closet, get it out of sight, and for the time they're visiting, he's going to be a healthy elder. This means that the youth will receive connection with the grandfather, empowerment by learning what it is to be a man, learn about the cultural vision of manhood, and develop an identity of being a man instead of a jerk. But the grandfather is going to get connection with the grandson, the empowerment of teaching what it is to be a man. He's going to re-engage with his vision of what it is his grandfather taught him about being a man and perhaps being a grandfather. And his identity is going to shift from being a drunk old man to being an elder for his grandson. That means two people are healing instead of one, because a community resource is being used. Here's another example. The youth might go to a treatment center to help detox and, importantly, learn to be sober for a period of maybe 6 weeks or whatever the program is. But then on returning gets engaged in ceremony, whether it's a sweat lodge or anything else. If it is a sweat lodge, not only does the youth, but so does the sweat lodge participants and leader develop connection. And they all develop empowerment in teaching somebody new the experience of the sweat lodge and doing it with them. They're all engaging in culture that's becoming stronger, cultural vision, because the sweat lodge is now being practiced by one more person. And the identity of the youth is now as a member of a healing spiritual circle. Then he might go to a counselor. But he also might go hunting with his uncle. And perhaps they bag a deer. And then some of that deer is given to his grandfather to thank him for the teachings. Some of it is given perhaps to the family of the woman he mistreated. And some of the deer goes to the uncle. In that case, now the youth has connection with far more people and empowerment now as a hunter. His vision, he's learning cultural ways to hunt, and his identity has shifted from being a jerk to a hunter. But the uncle, who is also heavily using pills and other drugs, he knows to be clean and sober while hunting. So he gets a connection in the land the same way his nephew does. He gets the empowerment over drugs and alcohol, and he gets empowerment as a hunter. He's living culturally for the first time in what may be a very long time by hunting in a good way and teaching how to do it right. And his identity is becoming that of an uncle, a mentor, a teacher, and a hunter, instead of a drunk or an addict. So that means the uncle is healing as much as the nephew. For every example, when we use government-sanctioned resources to deal with the problem, and more importantly, community-based cultural resources to deal with opportunities for resilience, the community heals itself. The community is transformed every time it serves as the healer instead of a government program. So one crisis at a time, the community gets stronger and stronger and stronger if we decolonize our practice and recognize the community is the medicine. Thank you very much for engaging in this conversation, and I hope that you can carry your own source of connection, empowerment, the roles you play, and culture and spirit in your heart and bring it out in that of others.